Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this video I want to share with you some of the books that I have been reading recently. And you might be very excited to know that there is not a mystery in sight. We are done with March Mystery Madness, which I loved and was super fun, but I've also been reading some books that are not mystery books at all. And so for this reading roundup, I wanted to talk about those books that I've been reading. First up, Mad Miss Mimic by Sarah Henstra. This book I found not that long ago at a thrift store. It's a historical book which caught my eye. Also, this cover caught my attention. I thought it was really a cool cover with these flowers and the way that the words are interspersed among the flowers. That caught my attention. Now, I didn't realize until I got this book home and started reading it that it is actually a YA. It's a young adult historical, and I don't read young adult books. I'm not really very interested. But I read this one, and it was pretty good. It wasn't bad. You could tell that it was young adult, so I'm not going to keep it. I think I'm going to put it in a little free library and share the love, let someone else enjoy the story. It's set in London in 1872. 17-year-old heiress Leonora Somerville is preparing to be presented to upper-class society again. She's strikingly beautiful and going to be very rich, but Leo has a problem money can't solve. A curious speech disorder causes her to stutter, but allows her to imitate other people's voices flawlessly. Servants and ladies alike call her Mad Miss Mimic behind her back, and watch as Leo unintentionally scares off one potential husband after another. London is also a city gripped by opium fever. Leo's brother-in-law, Dr. Dewhurst, and his new business partner, Francis Thornfax, are frontrunners in the race to patent an injectable formula of the drug. Friendly, forthright, and devastatingly handsome, Thornfax seems immune to the gossip about Leo's madness. But their courtship is endangered from the start. The mysterious Black Glove opium gang is setting off explosions across the city. The street urchins Dr. Dewhurst treats are dying of overdoses. And then there is Tom Rampling, the working class boy Leo can't seem to get off her mind. As the violence closes in around her, Leo must find the links among the Black Glove's attacks, Tom's criminal past, the doctor's dangerous cure, and Thornfax's political ambitions. But first, she must find her own voice. So I thought it was interesting that the character has a stutter, and this idea of her being able to mimic others' voices was a little bit interesting as well. It was an interesting time period. The opium wars were going on. I find it so interesting to read stories that are set during that time period when opium was legal and people were using it without really understanding the effects that it has and how addictive it can be. So there is people using laudanum in this, experiments, creating morphine and heroin. So that was really very interesting. One thing that really bugged me though was there was a part in here where a character said to be careful not to touch an envelope because he thinks that the police can find the fingerprints. Let's see, what did he say? Mind you, don't leave a fingerprint on the envelope either. They say each man's is unique unto him, like a signature. That bothered me because this is set in 1872, and although people in India and Scotland were learning about fingerprints and investigating that concept, it wasn't well known. The police certainly weren't using fingerprints to investigate crime. If they did have fingerprints, it was only for the purposes of identifying criminals that were reoffending. So they weren't using them in investigating crimes. So that part bothered me because that was stuck in there, but it didn't fit the time period. Anyway, this was interesting. It wasn't horrible. It wasn't my favorite. but I am going to give it away to somebody else who might enjoy this YA maybe a little more than I did. So Mad Miss Mimic by Sarah Henstra. I also finished Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. This gorgeous edition was given to me at Christmas, technically Book Flood. We celebrate Book Flood on Christmas Eve, where we give each other a book by my fabulous in-laws. And this edition is just so beautiful. Look at the inside here. These charcoal drawings are just gorgeous. So, I have a funny story about Jane Eyre. I read Jane Eyre for Victober last year, or at least I thought that I did. It was technically a reread for me. I had read Jane Eyre years and years ago, and I had completely forgotten of just how big of a book that it was. And the edition that I had was this one, this fabulous old copy. It doesn't have a copyright date, so I'm not entirely sure. I have a feeling that it's from the 20s. And I didn't realize at the time that this was an abridged version. It is a heavily abridged version, because I was reading, especially at the beginning, and I thought to myself, isn't there stuff missing here from her experiences at Lowood School? I thought to myself, I thought there was more about that. And so then I kept reading, and I finally realized that I was reading an abridged version of the story. But when I got this fantastic edition and I decided to read from this, I realized that the abridged version I had also made a few changes to the text, which I found odd. And the way that they abridged it was also very strange. So here's some examples. So she is with her cousins, St. John and, oh, I've forgotten their names. The two sisters. Anyways, the ease with which love was broken between two good persons got hold of me like a mania against such looseness and weakness. Despite my reason, I started a search to discover what had become of Mr. Rochester. I was defeated and humiliated at every move until I became desperate. In the midst of this obsession, St. John began with powerful persuasion to urge me to become a missionary and go with him to that great self-sacrificing work. But I do not understand missionary life, I insisted. I have never studied missionary labor. And within a page and a half, maybe 2 pages, that whole saga is finished. It remains for me then, he said, to remember you in my prayers and to entreat God for you in all earnestness that you may not indeed become a castaway. I had thought I recognized in you one of the chosen, but God sees not as man sees. His will be done. My decision was made. It was my duty and my will to know what had become of Edward Rochester. Also, weirdly enough, they take out the part where she hears him calling her name. She just mentions that she thought she heard his name or something like that. So there's weird, little sections in here. She immediately leaves to go back to Thornfield, and the famous line, they change, which is weird. And so I married him. A quiet wedding we had. He and I, the parson and the clerk, were alone present. Why would they do that? They've left, maybe, I should go back and see if they've left the rest of her times when she talks to the reader. Anyway, this was a very strange abridged version of Jane Eyre, but I read the full text and loved it. I really loved Jane Eyre. I gave it 5 stars. I think it is just a fabulous story. A couple things that I found interesting was the juxtaposition or the differences between St. John and Rochester, and how they both use the term God sees not as man sees. So St. John, who has been trying to convince her to marry him and go to India, and he has wrapped up in his mind that her decision to come with him and be a missionary is the same thing as marrying him, and that if she chooses not to marry him, that she is somehow failing in her Christian duty. And he says to her, "It remains for me then to remember you in my prayers and to entreat God for you in all earnestness, that you may not indeed become a castaway. I had thought I recognized in you one of the chosen. But God sees not as man sees. His will be done." And later, Rochester ends up saying the same thing. "Jane, you think me, I dare say, an irreligious dog, but my heart swells with gratitude to the beneficent God of this earth just now. He sees not as man sees, but far clearer, judges not as man judges, but far more wisely. I did wrong. I would have sullied my innocent flower, breathed guilt on its purity. The Omnipotent snatched it from me. I, in my stiff-necked rebellion, almost cursed the dispensation. Instead of bending to the decree, I defied it. Defying justice, pursued its course. Disasters came thick on me. I was forced to pass through the valley of the shadow of death. His chastisements are mighty, and one who smote me, which has humbled me forever. You know I was proud of my strength, but what is it now when I must give it over to foreign guidance, as a child does of weakness?" I thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition of those two characters and their understanding of God sees not as man sees. And then I read Mr. Rosenblum Dreams in English by Natasha Solomons. I first heard of this from somebody's booktube channel, and I forget who. But it is a post-World War II novel, and I really enjoyed this story. I thought it was so good. At the outset of World War II, Jack Rosenblum, his wife Sadie, and their baby daughter escape Berlin, bound for London. They are greeted with a pamphlet instructing immigrants how to act like the English. Jack acquires Savile Row suits and a Jaguar. He buys his marmalade from Fortnum and Mason and learns to list the entire British monarchy back to 978 AD. He never speaks German, apart from the occasional curse, but the one key item that would make him feel fully British, membership to a golf club, remains elusive. In post-war England, no golf club will admit a Rosenblum. Jack hatches a wild idea. He'll build his own. It's an obsession Sadie does not share, particularly when Jack relocates them to a thatched roof cottage in Dorset to embark on his project. She doesn't want to forget who they are or where they came from. She wants to bake the cakes she used to serve to friends in the old country and reminisce. Now she's stuck in an inhospitable landscape filled with unwelcoming people, watching their bank account shrink as Jack pursues his quixotic dream. So, this is such a great story. It has got themes of marriage and grief and loss and remembrance, and I really enjoyed this story. There was a few things that I found really interesting, and I marked them here. Let's see. So Sadie has a recipe book that she got from her grandmother, and it is one of her prized possessions. Sadie read out the recipe. Whip together a batter made of eggs, the right amount of sugar, sufficient flour, and the perfect quantity of vanilla, which I think is hilarious, and also classic of the way recipes were handed down by people who were so familiar with how to make that recipe that amounts weren't necessary, that you just knew what it was. The quantities were never more precise than that. She had to know the correct amount in her heart before she began. And then a little bit later, she baked this specific cake from that recipe book, and it was called a bomb tort. Each cake was placed on top of another and then another until when dawn came there was a cake towering many feet high with 1,000 layers of rings, every layer holding a memory. She decided to bake that cake because it was a cake that they made for remembrance, a cake that holds memories, which I thought was such a beautiful concept. And so she takes this cake to the ladies in the village who have formed the coronation committee. They are preparing for Queen Elizabeth's coronation in the summer. And so she takes the cake to them. They were busy pinning posters to trees along the lane when the scent of baking overwhelmed them. It had a strange smell, not merely dough or sugar, but the fragrance of unbearable sadness. So in this book, Jack is so obsessed with becoming the perfect Englishman and building his golf course that he completely neglects his wife and does not see how sad she is and how she is not coping well. And then a little bit later, along with this concept of remembrance and memory, it was time for tea, and Sadie went to her bomb tort, which rested on a makeshift table, bowing under its weight. She cut slices for each of them with a huge knife, the thinnest that she could manage. The women ate, and it was the most remarkable cake that they had ever tasted. It was sweet and perfectly moist with a hint of lemon, but as her mouth filled with deliciousness, each woman was overwhelmed with sadness. Each tasted Sadie's memories, her loss and unhappiness, and whilst they ate, Sadie for once was not alone in her sadness. Mr. Rosenblum Dreams in English by Natasha Solomons. I've also decided to take part in the Lord of the Rings Read-Along 2020. I love the Lord of the Rings, but it has been probably over 20 years since the last time I read it, so I thought it would be fun to participate in a read-along with other people. Krista from Books and Jams is putting this together. There's a Goodreads group that is discussing this book, and so I read the first part, The Fellowship of the Ring. She's given 2 months for each book, and so I read the first part in February. I wanted to have it done before March so that I could focus on March Mystery Madness. And I have read this before, but I don't remember a lot about it, just that I loved the story. And I've watched all the movies, and although I do not read fantasy or science fiction, I absolutely love the story of The Lord of the Rings. And I think there's a few reasons for that. One of the reasons is the themes: good versus evil, the chosen one, the ordinary person doing extraordinary things, darkness versus light, betrayal versus loyalty. I love those big themes in this book. And I also love the depth of the world building and the concept of time, the passage of time, the history. There is no rush. I mean, these books are huge. He didn't rush through it, and I think that that helps with the world building, with the idea that this is a real place that has a long history. All of that helps to make this world real. Everybody has a backstory. Also, I think one of the reasons why I love this story so much is that it's a platform. Middle Earth that he has created is a platform. Other stories from this world don't need to have the same characters. So I really enjoyed my read of The Fellowship of the Ring, and I am looking forward to getting into The Two Towers here in April. I also finished What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen. 20 Crucial Puzzles Solved. And I loved this book. It was so good. I thought that it was such a great way to discuss the writing techniques of Jane Austen in such a unique way. So each chapter answers a different question. How much does age matter? Do sisters sleep together? What do the characters call each other? How do Jane Austen's characters look? Who dies in the course of her novels? Why is it risky to go to the seaside? Why is the weather important? Do we ever see the lower classes? Which important characters never speak in the novels? What games do characters play? Is there any sex in Jane Austen? What do characters say when the heroine is not there? How much money is enough? Why do her plots rely on blunders? What do characters read? Are ill people really to blame for their illnesses? What makes characters blush? What are the right and wrong ways to propose marriage? When does Jane Austen speak directly to the reader? And how experimental a novelist is Jane Austen? I absolutely loved this book. I would recommend it to anybody who loves Jane Austen and to anybody who is interested in literary criticism. There is just so much good stuff in here. So in the chapter on What Do Characters Say? Austen's heroines are vivid to us because her novels are narrated from their points of view and suffused by their consciousnesses. Yet one of Austen's devices is to leave her heroine behind to give us a glimpse of what the world is like in her absence. In all her novels except Mansfield Park, this is done only occasionally so that we receive a peculiar jolt when it happens. In his chapter on why do her plots rely on blunders? He is talking about Captain Wentworth in Persuasion. When he thought he was being manipulative, he was in fact making the clumsiest of mistakes. For a blunder is not just an error, it is an error that another person has noticed. So it serves an oddly powerful double purpose in Austen's fiction. It can embarrass or mortify, but it also reveals a person's true feelings. I really enjoyed the chapter on what makes characters blush. I thought it was such an interesting concept, and it brought out such interesting developments of the character and what certain blushes meant. In Austen's novels, however, the blush becomes a challenge to the intuition of other characters and often the reader too. When, like Eleanor, one character blushes for another, it is usually a sign of displeasing insight. So all the different things that a blush could mean, I found that really interesting. And he's talking again about persuasion. And Anne, she blushes in vicarious shame at Lady Russell's evasive dishonesty, but also perhaps she thinks at her own eager perceptiveness, sharpened by her hopes for Captain Wentworth's affections. Anne has begun to learn the importance of blushing. Earlier in the novel, she has thought herself beyond a blush. When Mrs. Croft refers to the fact that Anne is acquainted with her brother, she is electrified. The only time that Austen ever uses this word. The OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, records the earliest use of electrified to mean very excited or thrilled in 1801. An unusual word is needed for the strong surprise of Anne's response. Also in the same chapter, one of the few critics who has written on blushing in Austen's fiction describes a blush as a truth yielded against one's well-behaved will. Yet the truth that a blush yields is not always what an observer presumes. Jane Austen uses blushing to alert us not just to the secret feelings that possess her characters, but also to the habits of misinterpretation that secrecy engenders. Then, in her chapter again on what makes characters blush, the blush, in other words, is a challenge to the reader's insight. I liked that. And then, in his chapter on how experimental a novelist is Jane Austen, Austen gave her readers an entirely new sense of a person's inner life, but through new kinds of narrative rather than new insights into human nature. I thought that very interesting, that she essentially created a new kind of narrative. In that same chapter, Austen's most powerful innovation was to realize this lack of self-knowledge in the very voice of the narration. In Emma, she concentrates this effect as never before, narrating almost entirely from her heroine's point of view and bending reality to match her preconceptions. We hear Emma, as we heard Mr. Darcy, commending her own judgment. Much later in the 20th century, critics came to call this technique free indirect style. I thought that was really interesting, that basically Jane Austen created free indirect style. And in that same chapter, extraordinarily, Austen not only discovered the possibilities of free indirect style, she produced in Emma an example of its use that has hardly been matched. So confident did she feel about her control of the technique that she made her plot depend on it. And another quote from that chapter, Austen showed that direct speech could be used to represent not so much what was said as what others might have heard. Here is Mrs. Elton at the party at Donwell Abbey, talking as she picks strawberries. The best fruit in England, everybody's favorite, always wholesome. These the finest beds, the finest sorts, delightful to gather for oneself, the only way of really enjoying them. Morning decidedly the best time, never tired, every sort of good. Hot boy infinitely superior, no comparison, the others hardly eatable. Chili preferred, white wine finest flavor of all. And then she goes on. It's an extraordinarily impressionistic rendering of talk that becomes a slightly mad monologue. For half an hour was the conversation. Conversation with Mrs. Elton is not much like an exchange, so there is justice in stripping out all the voices except hers. The ability to enter into dialogue at all is an achievement. And then finally, as well as allowing the narrative to be shaped by a character's thoughts, Austen also had a technique for the suggestive avoidance of those thoughts. In Mansfield Park, Edmund and Mary Crawford are discussing the character and occupation of clergymen, with the latter using the example of Dr. Grant to show that members of the clergy are often not admirable men. Miss Crawford wishes Fancy a better fate than to be married to such a man, quarreling about green goose all the week. Fanny turns into the window and turns away from us too, for Austen absents herself from knowing, or anyway from telling us what her heroine feels. The turning away dramatizes the pitch of Fanny's feelings. Mary Crawford senses something and covers the awkward moment graciously, but she does not know the half of what Fanny feels. The narrative's own reserve about Fanny's feelings enacts the character's own tenderness on the subject of her love for Edmund. So, if you've never read What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullen, I can highly recommend it. It was a great book. And then finally, I wanted to show you this chunker of a book. I got this from the library, and I didn't read through the whole thing, but I did flip through it, and it was so interesting. The Writer's Map, an Atlas of Imaginary Lands, edited by Huw Lewis-Jones. And I just thought this was gorgeous and such a fascinating idea. So it just includes a whole bunch of maps. I'm going to cover my head here so you can see this. A whole bunch of maps from literature. It is just beautiful. Here's a couple maps from, one is from Winnie the Pooh and one is from the Narnia stories by C.S. Lewis. Anyway, it was just a really interesting book, and so if you get a chance to check it out, if you enjoy maps, if you like to look at writers who included maps in their stories, then this might be the book for you to check out. So, The Writer's Map, an Atlas of Imaginary Lands. Okay, and that's it for my reading roundup. I know this was a longer video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have you read any of these books? What were your thoughts? Let me know what you think. Are you interested in reading any of these books? Let me know down in the comments down below. I always love to chat about books. So thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you for another video soon. Bye!